The Vietnam War is often remembered as a tragic clash between communism and democracy, a battlefield of the Cold War where ideology drew clear lines and demanded intervention. Yet, when we look closer, the story becomes less certain. Why did a regional conflict in Southeast Asia become one of the longest and most controversial wars in modern history? Why did U.S. policy shift repeatedly, even as official explanations remained consistent? And why did internal government documents later contradict the public justifications offered at the time? The more we examine speeches, memos, and decisions made behind closed doors, the harder it becomes to accept a single, simple motive. This raises uncomfortable questions about power, fear, credibility, and global strategy. In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. To understand the real motives behind the Vietnam War, we have to step back before American troops ever landed in Southeast Asia. Vietnam's modern conflict did not begin with the United States, nor even with the Cold War. It began under French colonial rule. For decades, Vietnam was part of French Indochina, governed primarily for economic extraction rather than national development. Rubber plantations, rice exports, and cheap labor defined the relationship. Resistance movements emerged long before communism became the dominant language of rebellion. Vietnamese nationalism was the original driving force, and it cut across ideological lines. Ho Chi Minh, later portrayed almost exclusively as a communist adversary, initially presented himself as a nationalist seeking independence. During World War II, his forces even cooperated with U.S. intelligence against Japanese occupation. American officers on the ground described him as pragmatic and popular, more focused on independence than ideological purity. This early cooperation complicates later portrayals. If Ho Chi Minh was always viewed as a communist threat, why was he once treated as a potential ally? The answer lies in how global priorities shifted after the war. The end of World War II transformed the global balance of power. Europe was weakened, empires were collapsing, and the United States and Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers. In this new environment, local conflicts were increasingly interpreted through a global ideological lens. Anti-colonial movements were no longer seen simply as struggles for independence, but as potential gateways for communist influence. Vietnam became one such test case. When the French attempted to reassert control over Vietnam after the war, they framed their effort as a defense against communism. The United States, initially hesitant to support colonial restoration, gradually shifted its position. Financial and military aid flowed to France, not out of loyalty to colonialism, but out of fear. American policymakers worried that a French defeat would embolden communist movements elsewhere. This fear was not hypothetical. China's Communist Revolution in 1949 dramatically reshaped strategic thinking in Washington. The idea that would later be known as the domino theory began to take shape. The idea was simple and powerful. If one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. This logic reduced complex societies into strategic tiles on a global board. Vietnam was no longer Vietnam. It was a symbol. Official statements emphasized containment, but internal discussions revealed deeper anxieties. The credibility of U.S. power was at stake. Leaders feared that retreat anywhere would be interpreted as weakness everywhere. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 marked a turning point. It ended French colonial rule in Vietnam and forced international negotiations. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided the country at the 17th parallel, with the promise of national elections to reunify Vietnam. These elections never took place. The reasons offered publicly focused on concerns about fairness, but private assessments acknowledged a more inconvenient truth. U.S. officials believed Ho Chi Minh would win decisively. This moment is critical. If the war was truly about defending democracy, why prevent an election likely to reflect popular will? Some historians argue this decision reveals one of the war's core motives, not the defense of democracy, but the control of outcomes. U.S. support for the creation of South Vietnam as a separate state, backing leaders who were explicitly anti-communist, regardless of their domestic legitimacy. Stability and loyalty mattered more than popular support. Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam's first leader, embodied this contradiction. He was presented as a nationalist alternative to communism, yet his government relied heavily on repression, favoritism, and U.S. backing. Internal U.S. reports described his regime as increasingly unpopular and disconnected from rural populations. Despite this, support continued. The fear of losing South Vietnam outweighed concerns about governance. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. As the conflict intensified, official rhetoric framed American involvement as limited and defensive. Advisors were sent, then more advisors, then combat troops. Each escalation was justified as a temporary necessity. Yet internal memoranda tell a different story. Policymakers acknowledged that victory was uncertain, that South Vietnamese forces lacked legitimacy, and that public support in the U.S. was fragile. Still, escalation continued. This raises a key question. If decision-makers privately doubted success, why persist? One explanation lies in the concept of credibility. U.S. leaders believed that withdrawal would damage America's reputation as a reliable ally and a formidable power. This concern appears repeatedly in internal discussions. Vietnam mattered not only for its own sake, but for what it represented to allies in Europe and Asia. The war became a test of resolve, not just against North Vietnam, but against the perception of decline. Domestic politics also played a role. Presidents feared being blamed for losing Vietnam, much like earlier leaders had been criticized for the loss of China. Political vulnerability shaped military strategy. Decisions were often made to avoid short-term political damage, even at the cost of long-term escalation. The war thus became trapped in a cycle where no option seemed acceptable. Withdrawal risked humiliation, escalation risked disaster, and compromise appeared impossible. Economic considerations, while less openly discussed, also influenced strategy. Southeast Asia was viewed as a region of strategic resources and trade routes. Maintaining influence there was seen as essential to long-term economic stability. While Vietnam itself was not a major economic prize, its position mattered. Control of the region was linked to access, markets, and influence. These factors rarely appeared in public speeches, but they shaped the strategic calculus. The language of the war further obscured its motives. Terms like free world, aggression, and defense simplified a conflict rooted in history, nationalism, and social change. By framing the war as a binary struggle, policymakers avoided confronting its complexity. This framing also limited options. Negotiation was seen as appeasement and compromise as defeat. The result was a war driven as much by perception as by reality. By the early 1960s, the United States was deeply entangled in Vietnam, even though no formal declaration of war had been issued. The conflict existed in a gray zone, sustained by incremental decisions rather than a single decisive choice. Each step was justified by the previous one. This gradualism makes the war harder to explain, but it also reveals its underlying logic. Vietnam was not entered in a moment of clarity, but drifted into through fear, momentum, and unresolved contradictions. As we move deeper into the war's escalation, the gap between public justification and private understanding widens. Official narratives emphasized progress and resolve, while internal assessments grew increasingly pessimistic. This disconnect would eventually surface, reshaping public trust and historical interpretation. To understand the real motives behind the Vietnam War, we must continue tracing how fear, credibility, and power combined to override caution and doubt. As the war moved into the mid-1960s, the logic driving American involvement became increasingly self-referential. Decisions were no longer framed around achieving a clearly defined political outcome in Vietnam, but around avoiding the consequences of failure. This distinction matters. Wars fought to win and wars fought to avoid losing follow very different paths. Vietnam increasingly belonged to the second category. Internal strategy discussions reveal a persistent concern that defeat would undermine U.S. credibility not only in Asia, but globally. The question policymakers asked was no longer, how do we secure Vietnam, but what happens if we don't? This concern intensified after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's own approach to Vietnam had been cautious and conflicted. Publicly, he affirmed commitment to South Vietnam. Privately, he expressed skepticism about large-scale military intervention. His administration expanded the number of military advisors, but resisted deploying combat troops. After his death, President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited both the conflict and its unresolved contradictions. Johnson's escalation was incremental but decisive. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 became the public justification for expanded military action. Official statements described unprovoked attacks on U.S. vessels, framing the response as defensive. Later evidence revealed significant ambiguity about what actually occurred. Internal communications at the time expressed uncertainty, yet the incident was presented to Congress and the public as clear aggression. The resulting resolution granted the president broad authority to use military force without a formal declaration of war. This moment illustrates a recurring pattern. Ambiguity behind closed doors was translated into certainty in public. Policymakers believed that doubt could not be communicated without weakening resolve. Yet this approach also meant that strategic decisions were increasingly insulated from public scrutiny. The war expanded not because its objectives had been clarified, but because the political cost of restraint seemed higher than the cost of action. By 1965, U.S. combat troops were arriving in large numbers. The justification remained consistent, preventing communist expansion and defending South Vietnam. However, internal assessments painted a more troubling picture. Reports questioned the effectiveness of South Vietnamese leadership, the loyalty of rural populations, and the likelihood of decisive military victory. Some officials acknowledged that bombing campaigns and troop surges were unlikely to break enemy resolve. Despite this, escalation continued. This raises an important question. If American leaders understood the limitations of military power in Vietnam, why did they persist? Part of the answer lies in institutional momentum. Military planners emphasized metrics such as body counts and territory controlled, which created an illusion of progress. These measurements were easy to report and difficult to challenge, even when they failed to reflect political reality on the ground. War became something that could be managed statistically rather than resolved strategically. Another factor was the structure of Cold War thinking itself. The conflict was never viewed in isolation. Vietnam was connected in the minds of policymakers to Berlin, Korea, and Taiwan. A loss in one place was believed to reverberate elsewhere. This belief persisted despite limited evidence that such direct causation existed. Yet in an environment defined by rivalry and suspicion, perception often mattered more than proof. The war was fought as much for allies watching from afar as for territory within Vietnam. Domestic political considerations further narrowed options. Johnson feared Republicans would portray withdrawal as weakness. He also feared alienating conservative Democrats. These concerns shaped decisions in ways that were rarely acknowledged publicly. The war became entangled with political survival. Each escalation was justified as necessary to preserve stability, even as it made withdrawal more costly. This dynamic trapped the administration in a cycle of commitment that grew harder to reverse. Economic considerations also played a subtle role. Defense spending surged, benefiting industries in regions tied to military production. While this was not the primary motive for the war, it contributed to its inertia. Once mobilization reached a certain scale, disengagement carried economic as well as political consequences. This reality further complicated decision-making, reinforcing the tendency to continue rather than reassess. At the same time, the war exposed contradictions in America's self-image. The United States presented itself as supporting self-determination, yet backed regimes that lacked popular legitimacy. It spoke of freedom, yet relied on overwhelming firepower in rural areas. These contradictions were recognized internally. Memos and briefings acknowledged that military success did not translate into political stability. Still, the war continued, driven by the belief that credibility could not survive withdrawal. As casualties mounted and media coverage intensified, public support began to erode. This created a new tension. Leaders worried that domestic opposition would embolden adversaries and weaken negotiation positions. As a result, dissent was sometimes framed as a threat rather than a warning. The gap between public rhetoric and private doubt widened further, undermining trust at home even as the war aimed to project strength abroad. The release of internal documents years later would reveal how deeply these doubts ran. Officials privately questioned the war's premises, yet publicly affirmed its necessity. This disconnect did not stem from a single deception, but from a series of rationalizations made under pressure. Each decision was justified by the fear that alternatives were worse. Over time, these justifications accumulated into a war that few believed in fully, but many felt unable to abandon. What emerges from this phase of the conflict is a picture of war driven less by clear objectives than by anxiety. Vietnam became a stage on which the United States attempted to prove resolve, manage perceptions, and avoid humiliation. The original context of Vietnamese nationalism receded further into the background. The conflict was no longer about Vietnam alone, it was about maintaining an image of control in an unpredictable world. As the war dragged on, this image grew increasingly difficult to sustain. The contradictions between official optimism and lived reality became harder to ignore. The motives behind continued involvement began to shift once again, shaped now by domestic unrest, international criticism, and the limits of military power. To understand how these pressures transformed policy and perception, we need to examine the later stages of the war, when doubt moved from private memos into public consciousness. As the war entered its later stages, the internal logic that had sustained American involvement began to fracture under the weight of reality. What had once been framed as a limited commitment to prevent communist expansion was now an open-ended conflict with no clear path to victory. The motives behind staying in Vietnam shifted again. It was no longer just about credibility abroad or containment of communism. Increasingly, it became about managing the consequences of a war that could not be decisively won, yet seemed politically impossible to abandon. By the late 1960s, the gap between official statements and internal understanding had become impossible to ignore. The Tet Offensive of 1968 marked a psychological turning point. Militarily, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy losses on the Viet Cong. Yet politically, Tet was devastating. For years, the American public had been told that victory was near, that enemy forces were weakening, and that progress was steady. Tet contradicted this narrative in a dramatic and visible way. The fact that coordinated attacks to strike major cities shattered public confidence. Inside the government, Tet confirmed doubts that had existed for years. Internal assessments recognized that even overwhelming military power could not secure political control. The enemy's willingness to absorb losses and continue fighting revealed a fundamental mismatch between American strategy and Vietnamese realities. The war was not being fought over territory alone, but over legitimacy, identity, and national purpose, these areas where firepower offered little advantage. At this stage, motives began to diverge within the U.S. leadership itself. Some officials pushed for escalation, arguing that increased force could still force a favorable outcome. Others advocated negotiation, not out of optimism, but out of recognition that the war's costs outweighed its benefits. President Johnson, exhausted and politically weakened, chose not to seek re-election. His decision reflected the toll on the war not only on Vietnam, but on American political life. When Richard Nixon assumed the presidency, he inherited a war that had already lost much of its public justification. Nixon's approach introduced a new motive into the conflict: exit without humiliation. His strategy of Vietnamization aimed to reduce American troop levels while transferring responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. Publicly, this was framed as a path to peace with honor. Privately, officials doubted whether South Vietnam could survive without U.S. support. Vietnamization was less about confidence in South Vietnam's strength and more about managing American withdrawal. At the same time, Nixon expanded the war geographically through bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. This apparent contradiction reveals the complexity of motives at this stage. On one hand, the administration sought to reduce U.S. casualties and domestic opposition. On the other, it wanted to pressure North Vietnam into negotiations by demonstrating continued resolve. Withdrawal and escalation existed side by side, driven by the same underlying fear that leaving too quickly would signal weakness. The release of the Pentagon Papers years later would reveal how deeply these doubts ran. Officials privately questioned the war's premises, yet publicly affirmed its necessity. This disconnect did not stem from a single deception, but from a series of rationalizations made under pressure. Each decision was justified by the fear that alternatives were worse. Over time, these justifications accumulated into a war that few believed in fully, but many felt unable to abandon. What emerges from this phase of the conflict is a picture of war driven less by clear objectives than by anxiety. Vietnam became a stage on which the United States attempted to prove resolve, manage perceptions, and avoid humiliation. The original context of Vietnamese nationalism receded further into the background. The conflict was no longer about Vietnam alone, it was about maintaining an image of control in an unpredictable world. As the war dragged on, this image grew increasingly difficult to sustain. The contradictions between official optimism and lived reality became harder to ignore. The motives behind continued involvement began to shift once again, shaped now by domestic unrest, international criticism, and the limits of military power. To understand how these pressures transformed policy and perception, we need to examine the later stages of the war, when doubt moved from private memos into public consciousness. When U.S. forces finally withdrew, the war did not end. South Vietnam continued to struggle, heavily dependent on American aid. When that aid diminished, its position collapsed. The fall of Saigon in 1975 symbolized the definitive end of American involvement. For many, it confirmed fears that had driven the war in the first place. Yet the global consequences did not match the dire predictions. The domino theory failed to unfold as imagined. While communism spread in some areas, it did not trigger the cascade that policymakers had feared. This outcome forces a reassessment of the war's real motives. If the worst fears did not materialize, why were they so persuasive at the time? The answer lies in the mindset of the Cold War. Leaders operated in an environment defined by uncertainty, rivalry, and the memory of recent global conflict. In such a climate, caution often gave way to overreaction. Vietnam became a symbol onto which broader anxieties were projected. In retrospect, the Vietnam War appears less as a calculated strategy and more as a series of decisions shaped by fear, pride, and institutional momentum. The United States did not enter the war with a single coherent motive. Instead, motives evolved over time, responding to political pressure, international rivalry, and domestic unrest. What began as a concern about communist expansion became a struggle to preserve credibility, then a fight to avoid humiliation, and finally an effort to escape with minimal damage. The Vietnamese perspective, often marginalized in American narratives, underscores this complexity. For many Vietnamese, the war was primarily about national unification and independence. External powers imposed their own interpretations, turning a local struggle into a global proxy war. This disconnect between local realities and global strategies was central to the conflict's tragedy. Understanding the real motives behind the Vietnam War requires moving beyond slogans and simplified explanations. It demands an examination of internal doubts, political calculations, and the human cost of decisions made under pressure. The war was not driven by a single lie or conspiracy, but by a convergence of fears that went unchallenged for too long. In the end, Vietnam stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing perception to override reality and of fighting wars not for what they can achieve, but for what leaders fear losing. As American policymakers struggled to redefine their objectives, another set of motives operated quietly beneath official strategy: the preservation of institutional authority and national self-image. By the late stages of the war, Vietnam had become deeply embedded in the credibility of American power itself. This was not merely about allies watching from abroad, but about how the United States understood its own role in the world. Withdrawal raised uncomfortable questions about limits of military force, of ideology, and of leadership. For a superpower accustomed to shaping outcomes, accepting such limits was psychologically and politically difficult. Military institutions in particular faced their own pressures. The U.S. armed forces had been built and trained to fight conventional wars against identifiable enemies. Vietnam challenged that model. Guerrilla warfare, political mobilization, and rural insurgency did not fit neatly into existing doctrines. Admitting this required more than tactical adjustment. It required institutional humility. Instead, the tendency was to adapt metrics to fit expectations. Progress was measured in sorties flown, bombs dropped, and enemy casualties. These figures provided reassurance that effort equaled effectiveness, even when strategic results remained elusive. This institutional momentum shaped policy in subtle ways. Commanders rotated frequently, each incentivized to show progress during their tenure. Long-term political outcomes mattered less than short-term indicators. This created a cycle in which escalation was continually justified as one more push from success. Doubt was acknowledged privately, but optimism remained the official language. Over time, the war took on a self-sustaining character, driven by processes rather than purpose. At the same time, the war served as a proving ground for American technology and military doctrine. Air power, surveillance, chemical defoliants, and advanced weaponry were deployed on an unprecedented scale. These tools reflected confidence in technological superiority as a solution to complex political problems. Yet their use often produced unintended consequences. Bombing campaigns disrupted rural life, displacement fueled resentment, and technological dominance failed to translate to legitimacy. Still, the reliance on technology persisted, reinforcing the belief that sufficient force could compensate for political weakness. Another underexamined motive was the fear of setting a precedent. Policymakers worried that leaving Vietnam would embolden not just communist movements, but nationalist challenges to American influence elsewhere. This concern extended beyond ideology. It touched on economics, access to markets, and the stability of post-war global arrangements. Southeast Asia was not central to American prosperity, but leaders feared perceived retreat would encourage challenges in regions that were. Vietnam thus became a symbolic battleground for maintaining a broader international order. This symbolic importance also shaped negotiations. In Paris, talks dragged on not because compromise was impossible, but because symbolism mattered deeply. Each concession risked appearing as weakness. The insistence on terms that preserved South Vietnam's formal sovereignty reflected a desire to claim moral and political continuity, even as practical outcomes slipped away. The agreement that eventually emerged allowed each side to interpret the outcome in its own way. For the United States, it was framed as an honorable withdrawal. For North Vietnam, it was a step toward inevitable victory. Within American society, the war's motives were increasingly questioned. Protest movements challenged not only the war itself, but the assumptions behind it. Critics argued that Vietnam revealed deeper problems in how power was exercised and justified. These challenges unsettled political leaders who feared that dissent would weaken resolve and invite external pressure. As a result, protest was often met with suspicion rather than engagement. This response further eroded trust and widened the gap between leaders and the public. The media played a critical role in this shift. Unlike earlier conflicts, Vietnam was broadcast into living rooms. Images of combat, civilian suffering, and returning casualties undermined abstract arguments about credibility and containment. The war's human cost became difficult to ignore. This exposure did not create opposition on its own, but it amplified doubts that already existed. The narrative of inevitable progress became harder to sustain when confronted with visible contradiction. Yet even as public opposition grew, policymakers remained constrained by their own earlier commitments. Decisions made in the early 1960s limited options a decade later. Each escalation had been justified as temporary and necessary. Reversing course required acknowledging that these justifications had been flawed. Few leaders were willing to do so openly. The result was a gradual, reluctant disengagement rather than decisive change. From the Vietnamese perspective, these shifting American motives appeared distant and inconsistent. For North Vietnamese leaders, the war was existential. They framed it as a continuation of anti-colonial struggle, first against France, then against the United States. This framing sustained morale and justified sacrifice. American attempts to impose costs through bombing and attrition failed to break this resolve. Instead, they reinforced the perception of foreign aggression. South Vietnam, meanwhile, remained politically fragile. Corruption, factionalism, and limited popular support undermined its legitimacy. American leaders recognized these problems, yet continued to support successive governments out of fear that collapse would confirm failure. This support further tied American credibility to institutions that could not sustain themselves independently. The war thus became a paradox. Fought to preserve stability, it prolonged instability. By the early 1970s, it was clear that the original motives for intervention no longer applied in any meaningful sense. Communism had not advanced as feared, alliances had not collapsed, and American power had not vanished. What had changed was the nation's understanding of itself. Vietnam forced a reckoning with the limits of intervention and the costs of conflating credibility with control. The war's later years reveal how motives can persist long after their relevance fades. Decisions were guided less by what Vietnam required than by what American leaders feared admitting. This does not imply cynicism or malice, rather it reflects the difficulty of reversing course once power, pride, and perception become intertwined. Vietnam became a lesson not only about foreign policy, but about the psychology of decision-making under uncertainty. As the conflict drew to a close, the question was no longer why the United States had entered Vietnam, but why it had stayed for so long despite mounting evidence that its goals were unattainable. The answer lies in the accumulation of motives over time, each layered onto the last until withdrawal seemed more dangerous than continuation. To fully grasp the war's meaning, we must examine how these motives shaped its aftermath and the lessons drawn from it, lessons that would influence American policy for decades to come. As the United States moved toward the war's final years, the convergence of motives, credibility, fear, political survival, and institutional momentum reached its most complex stage. By the mid-1970s, it was evident that Vietnam could not be won in the conventional sense. North Vietnamese forces remained resilient, South Vietnamese legitimacy was fragile, and American public support had eroded to historic lows. Yet withdrawal itself carried immense political and symbolic risk. Leaders feared that leaving without a negotiated settlement would be perceived as failure, not only by adversaries abroad, but by the American people at home. In this sense, Vietnam had become a war defined by the constraints of its own past, where each choice was determined as much by what had already been done as by what could realistically be achieved. President Richard Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization illustrates this tension vividly. The plan aimed to reduce U.S. troop involvement while transferring operational responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. Publicly, it was framed as a measured step toward peace with honor. Privately, however, officials recognized that South Vietnam's ability to maintain stability was limited. Vietnamization was as much about managing domestic perception as about creating sustainable outcomes on the battlefield. Simultaneously, covert operations and expanded bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos reflected a contradictory impulse, exerting pressure to secure negotiating leverage while attempting to reduce direct U.S. exposure. This duality exemplifies the war's evolving motives, where escalation and disengagement existed side by side, each justified by fear of loss. The Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, exposed the depth of this disconnect. They revealed that successive administrations had consistently misrepresented progress, downplayed setbacks, and overstated the South Vietnamese capacity to resist communist advances. They also showed that private doubts about the war's effectiveness existed from the earliest stages, yet public messaging maintained a narrative of inevitable success. This revelation reshaped public understanding and historical interpretation, demonstrating that the war had been driven as much by political calculation as by strategic necessity. International considerations remained another persistent motive. The United States believed that a retreat would embolden adversaries, not only in Southeast Asia but globally. The domino theory continued to shape thinking even as its predictive power faltered. Leaders feared that withdrawal would signal weakness, inviting challenges in regions far removed from Vietnam. Although the theory proved overly deterministic, it reflected the pervasive anxiety about maintaining global influence during the Cold War. Domestically, the war had profound consequences. Mass protests, civil unrest, and political polarization highlighted a growing dissonance between American ideals and wartime reality. For leaders, this domestic opposition was both a constraint and a motive for continued involvement. There was a persistent concern that visible defeat could embolden internal dissent, undermining governance and credibility. This interplay of domestic politics and foreign policy intensified the war's complexity, demonstrating that motives were not static but continuously reshaped by circumstances both abroad and at home. The eventual withdrawal and the fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the end of direct U.S. involvement, yet it also underscored the layered nature of the war's motives. The United States exited not because objectives were achieved, but because the cumulative costs, political, social, and human, became unsustainable. Even then, the legacy of credibility and fear persisted, influencing subsequent policy decisions, military doctrines, and public skepticism toward intervention. Vietnam had become more than a battlefield. It was a crucible in which the limits of power, perception, and political calculation were laid bare. Examining the war from this perspective challenges conventional narratives. It was not solely a moral crusade against communism, nor simply an effort to protect South Vietnam. Rather, it was a complex interplay of fear, pride, institutional pressures, and strategic uncertainty. Motives shifted over time, evolving from ideological containment to the preservation of American credibility to managing the consequences of an unwinnable conflict. At every stage, leaders faced choices constrained not only by external realities, but by the path they had already taken. Vietnam exemplifies how initial motives can mutate under pressure, creating a war that becomes more about sustaining decisions than achieving objectives. From the Vietnamese perspective, these motives were both opaque and consequential. North Vietnam framed the war as an extension of the struggle for independence, leveraging nationalist sentiment to sustain morale. South Vietnam, reliant on American support, was caught between domestic fragility and external expectations. The war, in effect, became a crucible in which both local and global forces intersected, with outcomes shaped by decisions and misperceptions on multiple levels. Understanding this interplay is essential for grasping the war's enduring complexity. The Vietnam War, therefore, cannot be reduced to a single cause or simple explanation. It was not entered lightly, yet it was extended under evolving pressures that often contradicted the original rationale. Ideology, credibility, political survival, and institutional momentum intertwined to create a conflict whose trajectory was shaped as much by perception and fear as by concrete military objectives. Leaders acted within constraints, sometimes rational, sometimes self-imposed, that made reversal difficult and sustained engagement seemingly inevitable. In conclusion, the real motives behind the Vietnam War were multifaceted, shifting, and deeply embedded in both domestic and international contexts. While anti-communism and containment provided the initial rationale, they were soon supplemented and in some cases overshadowed by concerns over credibility, political survival, and institutional self-preservation. The war's trajectory demonstrates how motives can evolve, how perception can drive policy, and how decisions made under uncertainty can create entanglements that are difficult to escape. Vietnam stands as a stark reminder that wars are rarely fought for a single, transparent reason, and that understanding history requires looking beyond public explanations to the complex web of fear, calculation, and human judgment that truly shapes events. This perspective does not absolve policymakers of responsibility, nor does it render the war morally neutral. It highlights instead how motives in international conflict are rarely simple, and how the gap between public justification and private understanding can have lasting consequences. The Vietnam War remains a cautionary tale about the costs of misperception, the limits of military power, and the enduring influence of credibility, fear, and political calculation in shaping historical outcomes. As American forces finally withdrew and South Vietnam struggled to survive independently, the full weight of the war's consequences became clear. The United States invested vast resources, political capital, and human lives, yet the original goals, containing communism, preserving South Vietnam, and demonstrating global credibility, remained only partially realized. The war did not produce a clear victory. It produced ambiguity, reflection, and profound national debate. This raises a crucial point. Vietnam was as much a war of perception as it was a war of geography and ideology. Decisions were driven by fear, pride, and the desire to uphold an image of power, often at the expense of strategic clarity. The conflict's legacy underscores the complexity of motives behind large-scale intervention. Fear of international embarrassment, concerns about domestic opinion, and the need to maintain institutional authority all contributed to escalation. Simultaneously, economic, technological, and ideological considerations reinforced inertia. What began as a limited support mission evolved into a prolonged engagement shaped more by the need to avoid perceived failure than by any achievable objectives on the ground. Internal doubts, acknowledged privately but never fully revealed publicly, highlight how policy can diverge sharply from public narrative. From the Vietnamese perspective, the war remained primarily about self-determination and unification. North Vietnam's persistence, combined with South Vietnam's dependence on American support, illustrates how external interventions can reshape conflicts, creating entanglements far beyond their original scope. The interplay between local nationalism and global strategy meant that motivations were never singular. They shifted depending on domestic pressures, international perception, and evolving political realities. Ultimately, the Vietnam War demonstrates that official explanations often conceal as much as they reveal. Publicly, the war was framed as a defense of democracy in the free world. Privately, it was a contest between caution and commitment, fear and pride, perception and reality. Recognizing this duality allows for a more nuanced understanding, not only of Vietnam, but of how nations approach intervention and war more broadly. The conflict is a reminder that motives are layered, decisions are constrained, and historical outcomes often reflect a mixture of rational calculation and human anxiety. Returning to the questions we posed at the outset, it becomes evident why Vietnam is still studied so closely. Why did a regional conflict escalate into a global proxy war? Why did the United States remain committed despite persistent doubts and mounting costs? And why did credibility, fear, and perception sometimes outweigh clear strategic objectives? The answers are complex. The Vietnam War was never about a single cause or simple ideology. It was about a convergence of motives, evolving over time, shaped by domestic politics, global rivalry, institutional momentum, and the human desire to avoid perceived failure. In this way, Vietnam challenges us to look beyond surface explanations, to question conventional narratives, and to understand that wars, especially those involving great powers, are rarely fought for purely stated reasons. The real motives are layered, often contradictory, and inseparable from the context in which decisions are made. History, in this case, leaves no neat conclusions, only lessons about the interplay of fear, strategy, and human judgment.